Hello, and welcome to Politics at Jack and Sam's Daily, the podcast that leaps in the air, scores an overhead kick in the last minute, and saves your election campaign day.
Whatever that means. My name is Sam Tate of Sky News, and with me is Jack Blanchard of Politico. And it's day 40 of the election campaign, meaning we've made it. It's election week, 3 days to go until polling day.
We have endured 40 days and 40 nights of this, Sam. It's sort of been a biblical experience right from the rain on the very first day.
Just to be absolutely clear, we haven't been together 40 days and 40 nights. We've just seen each other each morning.
It's just felt like that sometimes. I hope you had a lovely sunshiny weekend, more relaxing than my 3-year-old birthday party, Sam.
I certainly did, ending up in the garden last night. But here we are again, starting at home in London, a day of election programme rehearsals and then going round the country one last time. It's been very interesting. I felt like most of my trips with leaders on this election campaign have been to the Midlands, so I wouldn't be surprised if I ended up there or thereabouts later today.
Let's talk about what's happening today. The two main party leaders are dashing off back on the campaign trail after pausing to watch the football last night, and it is very much in the whistle-stop tour mode of election campaigning at this point. They're rushing around as many seats as they can in key target areas, and we'll be looking at where they're doing that and what they'll be doing when they get there. We'll be talking about the smaller parties as well, including some jitters amongst the Lib Dems, and we'll be talking about what Keir Starmer is planning for government when he gets there. And finally, we'd better talk about France as well, because the far right made sweeping gains, or at least came out well on top in last night's French legislative elections, and that is going to have huge implications for whomever wins our election on Thursday. Where should we kick off, Sam? Should we start with Labour?
That's right, because I think the way that the different parties are campaigning is telling us a lot about where they expect the election to come out on Thursday. So yeah, begin with Labour.
Keir Starmer is heading to the home counties today, and I think the places that he goes, I'm rather obsessed with this, but it really tells you very much about where they think the battles are being fought. The idea during my political lifetime that a Labour leader a few days out from an election will be focusing on Hertfordshire, Buckinghamshire and Oxfordshire is just insane, but that is where Labour thinks its biggest gains are going to be made, and that's where you'll see Keir Starmer popping up today with stump speeches, with media questions at every stop, driving around in that bus. And I think the real thing for Labour is showing that they are back in the south of England in a way that a few years ago we were talking about it seemed impossible. I remember having conversations, Sam, when we'd be saying, will Labour ever win in the south of England again? That was only a few years ago that it just seemed out of the question, and now they are targeting seats that were so safely Tory that you never would have dreamed it. And it really gives an indication that the polling that we've been seeing in this election is absolutely on the money as far as the party's internal polling is also concerned. So the idea that the polls are totally wrong is still possible, but the parties believe it to be true as well.
That's right. What's interesting about the places that Keir Starmer's going is there's some of the places where you might have also expected the Lib Dems to be trying to make significant gains, but now you've got just Labour. It feels like tiptoeing into some of those areas that Lib Dems have also been interested in with the sort of blue wall. Labour are trying to sort of avoid any sense of complacency in the last few days. They've released a poster this morning. It's not the most attractive thing to wake up to and look at in the newspapers that they've bought advertising space in. And I presume it's been mocked up because it's a picture of Rishi Sunak lying in bed next to you with "Don't wake up with 5 more years of the Tories." Funnily enough, the biggest news on the Labour side that they'll like isn't something that's going to really resonate with voters, but is something that I think will be a bit of a shock to the Tories. And that is the defection to Labour of Lord Harris of Peckham. Now, he is an incredibly influential figure because for years he's been not only a big Tory donor, but he has been the sort of founder and champion and the person who's sort of taken on and supported all the Tory education reforms, a massive backer of Michael Gove. And if you've noticed, Jack, one of the things that the Tories have been trying to claim in this election campaign is that the Tories are the party of higher education standards. But in this letter to the Times this morning, where he reveals his defection, he says, at this election, it is no longer the Conservatives that are the party of high and rising standards, no longer the Conservatives putting our children and their schools front and centre. Despite a merry-go-round of ministers in recent years, they are out of ideas, and he praises Bridget Phillipson. I just think in terms of the sort of Tory psyche, to lose a backer of that stature at this stage who is specifically homing in on an issue that they've been campaigning on will feel like a bit of a hammer blow this morning.
Half the Labour Party around Keir Starmer will already be thinking about what they're going to do if and when they do win this election on Thursday, and already starting to make preparations for that. And we saw at the weekend some more details coming out in terms of exactly what they're planning to do, extending the parliamentary sitting by an extra few days, bringing us all back early after the summer, trying to move quickly on issues like housing, so there's a sense of urgency when they do come in. I think the other interesting thing they're going to have to do, though, Sam, is actually try and introduce Keir Starmer to the country. I mean, this guy's been going around on the campaign trail for 40 days now, banging on about his dad being a toolmaker and all the rest of it. How much of it is really cutting through remains to be seen. We've got some really interesting research today from Public First, the polling company, looking at how much voters actually know about Keir Starmer. The truth is, not very much at all. Something like a quarter of them don't even know he was a lawyer. They think he's worked in politics his whole life. Half of them think he's never had to worry about money, even though he keeps talking about the struggle to pay the bills. Half of them think he doesn't like football, even though he plays football every week and talks about football all the time. Like these messages that you and I and people like us hear all the time and can probably now recite in our sleep after the last few weeks. Lots of people just haven't heard them at all. And so if Keir Starmer does win on Thursday, he is going to be introducing himself to the nation for the first time in a really big way. And how that lands, the first impressions are so important. If he can get the first few days and weeks right, it could make a huge difference to how his premiership goes. And it's easy to forget that when you just watch these people making the same speech again and again because you're sad and geeky and interested in politics like we are, unlike most people who couldn't really give a monkey's.
That's one of the reasons I am told by some Labour figures that the campaign director, Morgan McSweeney, is likely to go in a senior job to Downing Street alongside his chief of staff, Sue Gray, for the very reason that you just talked about, because I think Labour are conscious that they need to, from day one in government, if that happens, tell a story that the nation understands about what they're doing and who they are. Labour haven't always been very good at sketching a big picture story about what Keir Starmer wants to do. Sometimes I even find myself wondering why Keir Starmer's in politics. What's the driving thing he wants to change? And I think because the economic outlook is so difficult, because they know that they have to sort of make an impression on the public from the very start, that guy who's been crafting the election campaign will go in. But that'll create quite an interesting dynamic in Downing Street, because Sue Gray and Morgan McSweeney have in the past been the only two to have sort of direct access to Keir Starmer. And whatever their job titles, and I don't know what they're going to be, having two figures sort of slightly battling for Keir Starmer's ear will be a dynamic that I suspect, spend some time watching and looking out for signs of how that's going in the opening phase of the Premiership.
I can already see the glee in your eyes, Sam, as you imagine the Labour split stories that you're going to be talking about and writing about over the months to come, because it always happens, doesn't it? They all always start falling out with each other once they get into that weird building in the middle of London. Let's talk about the Prime Minister. He's also got an extremely busy day, as you'd expect. He's trying to show the energy and the vim and the vigour of somebody who believes they can still stay in Downing Street, even though if in his heart he may be starting to believe that's probably not going to happen. He's going big on in the Telegraph this morning with probably his most audacious claim so far, I would say, about Labour, saying that Vladimir Putin himself is dreaming of a Labour victory, which I'm not sure if we can totally stand that one up, but nevertheless it makes a lovely headline. And at the heart of it, as all good political attack messages should always be, there is an element of, I don't say truth, but Labour has not been as clear about how it will increase defence spending as the Tories have, at least in terms of a timescale, and the Prime Minister is using that to try and make an attack on Labour about their commitment to defence. I mean, Of course, Keir Starmer has been unequivocal in everything he said about Russia and Ukraine, that there will be no backing down, there will be no real difference in the approach we've seen from the current government. But nevertheless, the Tories want a new attack line, and one that will grab headlines. And so Rishi Sunak is going to be pushing that point today. I would just say, again, have a look at where Rishi Sunak actually is today when he's touring the country and making his speeches and giving his media clips. He's heading to Staffordshire, and there are lots of vulnerable looking and increasingly vulnerable looking Tory seats in that part of the world. This is not a guy who's heading off into Labour territory trying to win new seats at all. He is defending Tory seats because his internal polling is saying the same things that our external polling is saying, that the Tories are likely to lose seats all over the country.
Isn't it fascinating that the kind of closing Tory message has sort of ended up co-opting the Kremlin? And the reason it's fascinating is because basically the Tories are having to fight in two directions in the closing week. And I didn't really think I'd have to say this at the start of the campaign. But on the one hand, they're making an argument about Labour and defence spending, as you say. But on the other hand, they're trying to make a slightly awkward dotted line between reform and Nigel Farage's comments about the Ukraine war and the Kremlin sort of maybe being in favour of Nigel Farage's position, although if you listen to Oliver Dowden on the Sunday shows yesterday on Trevor Phillips, he was sort of saying, well, of course, there's no collaboration between the two, but it just so happens that this is going to work out in Vladimir Putin's interest. But that's a mark of where Rishi Sunak is, right? He is caught in the middle, having to face both right and left, and the only argument that they have settled on working is to try and invoke the spectre of Russia benefiting from this. Because when you look at the main Labour-facing attack this morning, the Tories have released a press release warning of all the things that Labour would do, but it reads like a Labour press release. It advertises 8 different things that Labour will do, which they say are harmful. But in amongst that, there is scrapping the Rwanda policy, building on the Green Belt, and votes at 16. All of things I think, they'd be quite happy to have the Tories, pumping out in their press releases.
Fighting on two fronts rarely ends well for people, as military historians will tell you, and it is a very difficult situation for Rishi Sunak. And Nigel Farage, he's had a difficult few days with Reform UK. He keeps being undermined by his own candidates. They're either defecting, or they're being sacked, or they're being caught on camera saying something absolutely outrageous, and it keeps eating up the headlines, whereas he wants to be talking about the reform surge and the people uprising. Nevertheless, we pay a lot of attention to those kinds of stories. There is no doubt there has been a big groundswell of support for Nigel Farage in this election. And you saw in his rally yesterday, here's a guy who can stand up in an arena and thousands of people will come out and get very excited watching him. And we've certainly seen scenes like that around the world before. And it is easy to underplay what might be happening in some parts of the country with the supporters that Nigel Farage has brought with him. And it's a difficult situation for the Tories. Trying to attack two parties at once is very, very hard. Labour are largely ignoring reform because they can do, and that makes things much easier for them. Should we talk about the Lib Dems as well, Sam? Very keen that we always talk about the Lib Dems because, as said before, poll predictions suggest they could be in for very, very big gains. They are concentrating on what they call the blue wall today. You can expect to see Ed Davey all around the south of England over the next few days, trying to hoover up again some of those Tory seats that we probably thought would always be blue, may now be turning yellow, particularly ones that have got big sewage problems. The sky's the limit for them, isn't it? What do you think? Are they getting super excited over there? Do they believe they can be ready for opposition in Lib Dem HQ come Friday morning?
I think there are some jitters. I was talking to some Lib Dems over the weekend. One of the things that has affected their campaign are these MRP polling projections that YouGov and others have done, putting them in the kind of 60, 70, 80 seat territory. And that's not the number that they've been working on. They've ended up having to sort of funnel money into those higher ambition seats in the latter stage of the campaign. But if you haven't done the groundwork, Lib Dems worry that you're not going to reach those kinds of numbers. And then if, by any measure, Ed Davey does really well by getting 40 seats, just the narrative of the campaign might mark that down as a disappointment. Ed Davey's big goal is to supplant the SNP as the third biggest party in Parliament. They want that crown back that they had for so many years but lost after 2015. And they think, a lot of Lib Dems are now talking in the sort of 40, 45 seat region if they can. And that feels a bit more realistic than some of the MRP projections. So they're worried that a big success for Ed Davey on Thursday may yet be marked down as a bit of a disappointment. I also just wanted to highlight something just frankly weird. Now, you might remember Nick Clegg. He was once upon a time Deputy Prime Minister. He's actually done an event in this election campaign. That was a rally for the Lib Dem candidate in the seat that he took over in Sheffield Hallam. Also, he did a rally for the candidate who wants to take over from him as the MP in Sheffield Hallam, the seat that he lost in 2015. But also, and it's happened about a week ago, but I don't think anyone really picked it up, he's done a tweet thread. And all I can say, Jack, is it's not the kind of thread that I think Lib Dem HQ necessarily would have wanted to see, because it begins sort of endorsing Labour. He says on social media, "For the country's sake, I hope Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves succeed in restoring growth to the British economy." But then he goes on to make 2 points, again, I think ones that the Liberal Democrats would not be wholly in favour of. The first is to demand that Labour push for immediate re-entry to the customs union, which is a longer-term ambition for the Lib Dems, but not something on their literature. And then he goes on to do a sort of to defend the coalition years, which is again something that Ed Davey is conspicuously not doing and didn't do in the interview that I did with him a few years ago. Basically saying Labour, might want to blame the coalition for low productivity, but actually the coalition did a good job. All of those things don't feel like the most helpful intervention from a former leader at this time.
Let's talk about France, shall we? Because the French elections last night are a massive story. They're leading the bulletins this morning, and rightly so, because Marine Le Pen's National Rally made massive gains in the first round of the snap parliamentary elections called by Emmanuel Macron the other week after he got crushed in the European elections. Talk about election gambles gone wrong. Rishi Sunak must be giggling into his cornflakes thinking, well, at least someone's cocked it up worse than I have. The whole idea of Macron calling this election was to prove that the far-right surge could be halted, was to show that, in a real national election, they'd never get the sort of numbers that they pulled off in the European election. Well, it looks like in last night's national elections, they did better than they did in the European elections. And it's even possible that the far right will be on course for an absolute majority in the French Parliament after next Sunday's second round of voting. That is an absolute tidal wave sweeping across Europe now, and France will be the biggest country, of course, to be run by the far right in Europe, and a massive, massive deal for whoever becomes Prime Minister in the UK on Friday having to deal with this. Emmanuel Macron has a few days to try and save this now, and if to do so, it seems like the most important thing he could do is start pulling some of his candidates out of next Sunday's election, because there are lots and lots of places where there are three candidates standing for election on Sunday, and if Macron was to pull his candidate out to give the left-wing candidate a better chance of beating the far right, then those far right gains could be halted. Is he going to do that? Is he the kind of guy that pulls his candidates out? This is a leader who's been battling with the left all year in France. There is so much grudge and hatred there. It's very hard to believe that he would do that. But if he doesn't do it, then it's absolutely party time for Le Pen and her colleagues.
The sort of figurehead of the left, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, is very much on the radical left, and he's often compared to Jeremy Corbyn. The kinds of things that Macron was saying last night, that he wouldn't pull a candidate aside if, for instance, he judged the left-wing candidate to be anti-Semitic. Well, that just gives you a flavour of the complexity of the politics of what they're trying to do. But it is a strange system where you have consecutive weekends of voting. There are some 315 constituencies where there are three candidates now under the rather strange system that means that anyone who gets more than 12.5% of the vote goes through. It's just how many of those 315 he withdraws his candidacy. Just one reason, Jack, why this really matters in the UK. I was talking to figures in and around the top of Whitehall last week, and they are very concerned that if the far right get in, there will be basically a big push to renegotiate or even basically scrap the fundamentals of what's called the Le Touquet Agreement. And that's the thing that puts British passport checks on the French side of the border. It's an agreement that goes back to 2004. And there have been rumblings from all sorts of politicians about it, and it's not beloved in France. But there is a particular nervousness that absolutely key bit of infrastructure might be abandoned or scrapped by the far right if they get into power. It has been in the past a target of Marine Le Pen, and if that happens, I think the officials here worry that there will be utter chaos in northern France for people trying to get to the UK, and that whole system becomes even worse than it is at the moment. So that's the thing to watch. Is there any chatter? There hasn't been a great bit of chatter in the last few days about this, but is there any move on the 2K agreement if you have a far-right Prime Minister?
You can make a pretty good case that whoever the British Prime Minister is, the two most important politicians overseas you deal with is whoever's running France and whoever's running America, and just look at the way those countries' politics are headed. Look at the way we're headed, Sam. We better get out on the campaign trail ourselves. Have a wonderful day. There is not long to go. I shall look forward to seeing you again tomorrow morning.
See you tomorrow.